I'm not seeing it populating. Are you guys?
No, I'm not either, actually.
We're up to 10.
I see there's a number of 13
Oh, there, I
people.
see. Okay, sorry.
Yep.
Hey,
It's
Oh,
everybody, if
yeah,
you
here
would
we go.
like to put it into the chat box where you're joining us from, we'd love to see where you all are.
Oh,
Get started
welcome
in
from
just a minute.
Toledo. I have family in Toledo, so nice to see you. Thank you for being with us in the early evening from the UK.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, and welcome to EIHR's 2024-2025 webinar series, Human Rights in the Arts, Resistance, Activism, Healing. I am Kim Klett, the Deputy Director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights. And if you haven't already, feel free to put where you are joining us from in the chat box. So first, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about EIHR. Taking lessons from the Holocaust and other historic human rights violations, EIHR develops teaching materials, convenes training workshops and summits, and supports educator networks to give secondary students a deeper understanding of how egregious conflicts arise and evolve, how justice is served, and most importantly, how we can prevent future atrocities. And we hope that you will visit our website at www.eihr.org to find our many resources. We bring these programs to you free of charge, and we're happy to do so, but we do appreciate donations that you can provide. If you would like to make a donation to help cover costs for our webinars and to support our other programs, please go to the link that Colleen is putting in the chat box. This year's theme for our webinar series, as we've done for several years now, was chosen by our viewers. The arts are an important part of our lives, no matter what might be happening in the world. Think about the way that art can transform our emotions and our thinking, how we can use art to share our voices and ideas, and how it can act as a form of resistance when we are oppressed or mistreated. We have two more artists this year after today's session who will present in the next 2 months, and we hope you can join us for the rest of the series. Our next one on Sunday, March 23rd, we will be joined by Rebecca Davis, who will share the inspiring work that she has done incorporating dance for young people into post-conflict societies with her company, Mind Leaps. And we're dropping the link for that webinar. So if you want to register, you can capture that link. We'll also send it in our follow-up email. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land where EIHR's office resides. EIHR respectfully acknowledges the Piscataway and Nakachink or Anacostan people and the elders both past and present throughout the generations who have stewarded the land where EIHR gathers. As you listen today, please feel free to drop questions into the chat box. We also will have some time for Q&A afterwards. Like I said, we will send a follow-up email with the recording of the program, as well as any resources that are mentioned. And remember that you can watch past webinars on EIHR's YouTube channel, and you'll see the link for that in the chat box as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's guest, Michael Simonson. Michael has been part of the Baeck Institute since 2002. Since his beginnings as a new archivist, he has taken on many roles, including the position of Director of the Dr. Robert Ira Louie Reference Services and as Director of Public Outreach. Michael works closely with researchers and their needs, be it academic or personal genealogy. He has coordinated a number of programs online, as well as the monthly meetings of the Baeck Institute Book Club. You are always welcome to write him with any questions you have related to your research. And Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
thank you. Thank you for having me, Kim. Yes, so I will go now to my uh, presentation. Give me a moment here. Okay, hope everyone can see. So my presentation today is Secret Testaments, the Artist's Affair in Theresienstadt. A story of artist resistance and testimony. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly, just right now, about Theresienstadt. I think many of you here probably already know about its history. Theresienstadt was a garrison town that had been founded in the 1700s in Bohemia, north of Prague a ways. And it was a military town. So as you can see in this picture, it had fortified walls. It had garrison barracks, kind of big barracks that could hold a lot of soldiers in its original use. And it was also a town with a church, with stores. Over time, it lost its importance as a military town and was just a town where people continued to live in these structures. Now, in the Nazi time, beginning at the end of 1941, the Nazis decided to use the town as a gathering point for all the Jews in Czechoslovakia who they were planning to exterminate. In addition, they sent Jews from Germany and Austria there as well. And to a lesser extent, a few deportations came from the Netherlands. There were a total of 144,000 people crammed, very crowded, into this town. They endured hunger, they endured disease. 33,000, mostly elderly people, died in Terezin. They were unable to survive the conditions there. But the majority of people, 90,000, were deported to Auschwitz, Treblinka, and smaller numbers to other sites of killing in Eastern Europe. And we'll talk more, of course, about the history of Theresienstadt, but I wanted to just create a quick background about it. So I'm going to start kind of in a funny way, perhaps, in the sense that you can see the quote here. I'm not going to read the quote. You can read it, I'm sure. But I was interested in this quote, which came from the Holocaust and Genocide Studies, a journal in spring of 2022. It's called Surviving Art from Terezin, the satirical drawings of Pavel Fontel. And it's by a woman named Eva Stanchik. And I thought that it was really interesting to start thinking about the idea of art as recording historical facts and historical information. I think we so often think of art simply as something to beautify our homes, our individual lives, going to a museum, whatever. But as Art Spiegelman says at the bottom, who is, of course, the man who wrote Maus, the comic about Auschwitz, that using art allowed him to return to an earlier function that drawing served before the camera as a kind of commemorating, witnessing, and recording of information. What Goya referred to when he says, "This I saw." This is a painting of Goya, the 8th of May. It's a very famous painting. It was done as a response to the kind of liberal uprisings in Spain following the defeat of Napoleon, that era. And as we see here, we see an execution taking place. And we can see that it is indeed recording this violent historical moment. But of course, the artist is also putting into it his own ideas, right? So we see the main figure of the man whose face we see in the white with his arms stretched out and a kind of holy light on him, kind of like a Christ figure, and the people around him suffering and dying, and the soldiers, we don't see their faces at all. Of course, it's all in this darkness. So it's a testament to a historical event that actually happened. And it's also a piece of art. And I just thought on that note, I would include Raft of the Medusa by Jericho, which is something that many people also know, I'm sure, in this audience. This was based on a real shipwreck that happened when a ship called the Medusa sank, and 15 survivors rode a raft for many, many days until they were discovered. And this is the moment where they see a ship in the distance, and they are, in fact, being discovered. So again, it's a historical moment, but it also carries with it, the message, I would say, of the artist, and also the design of the artist. How he kind of created these two pyramids, one the top of the boat's pole, and the other the brownish man waving as alerting the ship in the distance that they are there, and then kind of the suffering of the people done in an artistic style, but of the time, but capturing a real event. So, point being that art has always been used to just to tell stories and events that are real, and art does in many ways has always served as a kind of testament. So I just wanted to start with thinking of that because we're going to look at a lot of art. So I'm going to examine art from the Theresienstadt ghetto. Now I say Theresienstadt because I work at the Leo Baeck Institute, which is a German-speaking archive and library, and that's its German word, the German word for it. Also, see, I spelled it wrong there. Theresienstadt. Please forgive me for that. And then Terezin is the Czech name for the town. And I often will say, I go back and forth, but I'll probably most likely say Terezin. Anyway, yeah, so the art of Terezin continues to hold important aspects of resistance as items of testimonial and aesthetic value, ethical, cultural value. And of course, they were created at a time when all these values were being destroyed under the persecution and extermination program of the Nazis. I wanted to talk about who these artists were. They came from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of places. So I'm going to start, I think, by talking about some of the individuals. So this first image is a drawing that was done by Peter Keen, and it's of an artist named Bertrich Fritte. Now, Fritte was a political cartoonist in Prague before the war. And he was born as Fritz Tausig, actually, but he went by this nickname of Fritter. And he legally changed his whole name in 1936, taking on the name Erdrich. And Erdrich means peaceful leader in Czech. He was part of a group that was first brought to Terezin. This is how we'll go through the history of Terezin as we go through the art. So Terezin was formed in 1941. The SS decided to bring many hundreds of young Czech Jews to Terezin first. And these people were going to be in charge in organizing the new ghetto/transit camp that Terezin was going to become. They had to build the barracks for the thousands of people who were going to arrive. They had to organize the soup kitchens, the giving of the food, the rules and procedures for life in the ghetto. And so these people, also these first people, they ended up taking valued positions in Terezin. They were, as I said, younger men and women, and they filled in a lot of important roles. So he was assigned, Bertrich Fritte, with many other illustrators and artists, to the technical department. So the technical department in the ghetto oversaw the creation of buildings, building renovations. There were a lot of carpenters. There were a lot of architects who worked in the technical department, the basic running of the camp, the electricity, the water supply, all these kind of things. But what the illustrators and artists did, largely, they were there partly to repaint and refurbish the actual ghetto buildings, kind of based on the ideas decided upon by the SS and by the Jewish administration that ran the ghetto. There was a Judenrat that is often referred to, the Jewish administration. And many of these people who came in the Aufbaukommando became part of that administration. The technical department was not a bad place to work. You were largely exempted from deportation, at least a lot of the time. And you could use your skills at times to receive better rations, cigarettes, medicines, other kinds of supplies. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the artists and illustrators, the artists we're going to talk about, they all ended up working in that technical department. So this is a self-portrait of Peter Keen himself. So he was a teacher at the Art Academy of Prague, and he also arrived at the end of 1941 as part of the Aufbaukommando. And he was appointed the head of the drawing department, which was a subdivision of the technical department in the ghetto. So he oversaw, drawings, and a lot of these drawings were actually architectural in nature for the building of new structures within the ghetto or the repairing of structures within the ghetto. There was also work that was to be done for the SS. The SS lived in headquarters outside of Terezin. In fact, they were hardly in the ghetto, to be honest. I was talking to someone who was in the ghetto for 3 years almost, and she only saw the SS twice, she says, that whole time. But the SS outside the ghetto, they also always wanted their headquarters renovated and redone, made nicer. And then there were also requests by the Nazis for approved art, kind of propaganda. Terezin, actually, this was an early idea of it, even in 42. They wanted to use Terezin for propaganda purposes, and they started making a film in 1942, which would show the ghetto as a pleasant place to live with well-dressed, well-fed people, etc. This first movie wasn't made, but a movie was made in 1944. Also in 1944, there was a very large visit, largely by the Red Cross, coming from Switzerland to inspect Terezin and see if what the Nazis were saying about it was true, that it was really a resettlement area where people lived in peace and were taken care of, etc. And what the SS did in that case is they had the whole ghetto kind of repainted and redone. Well, not the whole ghetto, but a certain route, I should say. They had the Red Cross follow a very certain route through the ghetto. And also, before the Red Cross visited, many thousands of people were deported to Auschwitz. So the ghetto looked less crowded. But in truth, the ghetto was still very crowded. How it worked was the people were divided by gender, and the women lived in their own living quarters and the men in theirs. And children lived with the gender that they were identified as being. There were also children's homes that provided a certain amount of education and more care, maybe to the children. But it was hard to get in those children's homes. You had to apply, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people who did not have connections, let's say, the children just kept living with the parents. The mother, if they were the girl, the fathers, if they were boys. Pavel Fontel, he was an artist as well who arrived in the 1930s. He had been a military doctor in the Czech army, and he always practiced art on the side. When he was deported, which was in 1942, actually, he also became part of the technical department doing this kind of work. Finally, we have a man named Norbert Trawler, who I will talk about. So at the Leo Baeck Institute, we have his collection. So he's probably the one I really know the most about. And he was an architect from Brno, and this is actually something he designed for a store, like a department store in Brno. I believe it was a department store. And he was deported to Terezin in the spring of 1942. So after the camp was set up at the end of 1941, the Jews of Czechoslovakia were generally, they began to round them up. And thousands, beginning in the spring of 1942, started arriving in Terezin and in occupying the spaces. And soon the ghetto was, in fact, very overcrowded. At the same time, in the spring of 1942, they started having deportations out as well. So people being deported to Terezin, they would be there sometimes just a few days or a few weeks, but some were there for many, many months, and some were there for years before they were deported. And then there was a certain smaller amount that survived the whole war in Terezin. So Trawler came a little later than the people on the Aufbaukommando. And he actually drew this. This is on the first, well, you can read what it says, so I won't go on about that. But this is a picture of the Jews in Brno. They were ordered to appear at a school at night. So they crowded into this kind of gymnasium area of a school. And they were told to bring whatever luggage they could carry. I don't know what the exact rules around their luggage were. It was different in different places. And then in the morning, they were brought to the train station, loaded up on trains, and brought to Terezin. So this is kind of the early morning when the people are getting ready to go to be sent to Terezin, to the railroad station in Terezin. And Norbert Trawler, he was among them. So it wasn't long before the summer of 42. And then they also started deporting Jews from Germany and Austria. It was people of all ages, but by this time there already had been many sweeping deportations in Germany and Austria. So the people that were left were largely older people. Often they were people who, for whatever reason, had been kept off the earlier transport lists, which were created by the various Jewish communities within Germany and Austria themselves. So they might hold back someone who worked for the administration or who they considered an important artist or writer or doctor or whatever. They were considered higher priority to keep, to protect. But in the end, in the summer of 1942, these last Jews, let's say, of Germany and Austria were sent to Terezin. And this is sometimes why you hear Terezin described as an old people's ghetto. It was really not designed for that. It was because the Jews from Germany and Austria brought to Terezin, where many of them were already quite elderly. But in truth, it was for Jews of all ages. Terezin, I mean, all the Jews of Czechoslovakia basically went through Terezin. So this is a piece of work by a man named Joe Speyer. Joe Speyer was from the Netherlands, and he was deported from Westerbork to Terezin in 1943. There were a few transports, not many, that went from the Netherlands to Terezin as well. This piece, which shows the walls and ramparts of Terezin, and also we see kind of this nice bucolic image of a town, was probably of the town of Terezin, was probably created for the SS. It was probably created for propaganda purposes as well. In 1944, when the Red Cross visited, they actually had an art exhibit. This is the kind of thing they would have shown at that. But of course, they used this, for other means too. And also, we can think of the SS and the Jewish administration and other people with some power in the ghetto. They, for cigarettes, which was the main currency actually in Terezin, or for extra rations or money that they could use for whatever their needs were, they created works like this to sell. So this is also, they could have been, sold cheaply to a Czech policeman who guarded the ghetto. There were two brothers who were Czech policemen, and they bought a lot of the artwork actually, which they then kind of collected and disseminated outside the ghetto. And this is what was going to lead to very big problems in the future. There were people who collected art within the ghetto. And then of course there were the SS. And another thing that the artists did a lot was they were ordered to copy works by the great masters. And then, these works then could be sold to private homes, etc. So there was a kind of economy for art in Terezin. So this is a staff vegetable garden, also by Joe Spire. And I think you can see again a kind of bucolic. This would be safely approved of, certainly by the SS and the administration that ran the ghetto. This is by Bedřich Fritta, and this shows the Vltava River, also known as the Danube in German, going through Prague. This was likely made as a kind of consignment for, we don't know who, but it could be he was planning to, sell it to the Czech policeman or to someone else within the ghetto. There was a man named Stas, Stass. He had been very wealthy. Now he ended up in the ghetto, and he was actually continuing to collect art in the ghetto, and he would hide it. He had a little bit more money and an ability to have his own little living area, which is something we'll talk about. And so he had it stored like under his bed in there. So, or it could have been made for a member of the SS too. But I think this would be something that would be used in a way for those kind of purposes. So another thing the artists did was they designed and painted kumbel. This is a kumbel for the bakery bosses. So what are kumbel? These are people, a kumbel is a space where more prominent Jews in the ghetto, they would pay the architects, the artists in the ghetto to create some kind of design for a small apartment within the ghetto. Now, this is quite extravagant because Norbert Traller, who did this design, he did this work for really a lot of the very high ups in the ghetto, like Jewish, really the Jewish administration. People who worked in the bakery, of course, for obvious reasons, they were very prominent because, of course, they had access to food. And you could get food, extra rations, and so on, if you knew the right people, right, in a place like the bakery. So the people who ran the bakery became quite prominent. And this is a living quarters. They managed to take a space in the barracks and create a small living quarters. Again, this is quite nice. But a lot of the administration did live in their own little apartments. Now, most people, when they had kumbels, even that term, it really just means they would take blankets or wood they found, because this is another thing. The architects and artists had access to wood and to fabric and to paint. No one else did. So they would usually what they did, I think, is more they took like a barrack, like a bunk, and then they would enclose it maybe with wood around it. So it was like inside the barrack, you had your own little private space. But some people were able to really get, livable situations. Now, we have to remember this is very rare. The thousands, and 99.9% of the people, the thousands, were living crowded together in barracks, in three-tiered bunks. So this is really a luxury people generally did not have. Well, they also did work for the SS, and this is another trawler plan for a kitchen area in the SS headquarters. And I know there was going to be someone in the audience today whose father worked as a carpenter in Terezin, and I know he was much liked by the SS administration for his work. And it's believable to me he would have worked on this kind of projects within the SS headquarters. So that was another thing that people could do. And actually, they redid the whole SS headquarters during the time Terezin existed. So now there's an artist named Leo Haas, and we're going to talk a little about him. He hasn't come up yet. He came, was deported as well to Theresienstadt, and he worked also in the technical department, just like these other artists. He was deported with his wife. I think this painting, this illustration is interesting because, you know, it asks a lot about the art itself. This was probably done clearly for a kind of propaganda purposes. The Jews of Terezin are well fed and they're working and they're good and strong people. But, you know, I think it's interesting because it also can be seen as a kind of an act of defiance that slipped through, because I do feel like the people look like they're saying, you know, we're here, we're marching on, we're not going to be beaten down. Leo Haas was originally from Czechoslovakia. He had lived in Germany a while in the 1920s in Berlin and was, you know, a serious artist. He moved back to to Czechoslovakia. He was considered, he moved back before the Nazi time, but the Nazis remembered him because he was considered a degenerate artist by the Nazi regime. He was friends with Frida, who we've been talking about as well, and he arrived in Terezin in the autumn of 1942. So he came a little later to become one of the artists working for the technical department. Again, this was very likely to be used for propaganda purposes, but I have to say I do feel there's a hint of defiance in it, which I like. This is a portrait of a woman named Zarina Kanova in 1943 by Charlotta Borisova. She was Jewish, of course, Charlotta was, and she was deported to Terezin. And there she did, she really worked a lot on copying the old masters and great works of art. Here, she also probably did this painting for, I'm guessing, for the Canova family. Maybe they paid for it to be done. Jarina Canova was deported and murdered in Auschwitz the next year. So, you know, the threat of the deportations was ever present. It's what everyone worried about in Terezin, and the worst fate, to be sent into the unknown. No one knew what happened to those people, only that they were sent to Poland. Some people seem to have known the name Auschwitz, but that they didn't know what was happening there. Charlotta Borisova came with the Aufbau Kommando as well in 1941. So she held a pretty prominent place within the hierarchy of the ghetto. So this is a drawing by Fritz Fabian. He was from Berlin originally, and he was deported and he was an architect actually in Berlin, and he was deported, and he became one of those who worked on the recreation of the ghetto in anticipation of the Red Cross visit and in anticipation of a film they were going to make, a propaganda film showing Terezin as a hospitable, wonderful place to live. So this is the old kind of, there is a town square there. Originally, before it looked like this, because they did redo the whole thing, this is the kind of thing the technical department was very involved with. There'd been a large tent here, and under that tent, there were many hundreds of women who worked as slave laborers within the ghetto, cutting mica, mica being a mineral that was used for transistor radios, for navigation for airplanes of the Luftwaffe. So it was a slave labor site. But then when the Red Cross were coming, they took down the tent, they painted everything, they planted new flowers, et cetera, et cetera. The people who were going to be in the movie received new clothes. And then I guess obviously Fritz Fabian was told or chose to draw this scene for propaganda purposes. This is the same yard as it was seen in the 1944 movie, which is commonly referred to as Hitler Gives a City to the Jews. So that isn't actually the name the Nazis gave it. But at any rate, so it's kind of an actual photo. It's actually a still from the film. So it's a good example of showing how the Nazis were trying to deceive the world about what was happening to the Jews along with this art that was being created. This is a birthday card for a man named Franz Feigl from Charlotta Borisova, and it's in Czech. It says, "Stay calm and prudent and breathe deeply." So it's a card of hope and strength and resilience. Jumping through this frame is a girl in a traditional Czech costume holding a bouquet of flowers. So Franz Feigl and his wife, they worked as framers in the ghetto. When this artwork was done, the official artwork especially, it had to be framed. And then, of course, they framed for, sometimes the Czech police, the SS, other Jewish prisoners who were able to provide cigarettes or rations of some sort. So this is a card at the Leo Baeck Institute, actually, in our collections. So, and it's a card that is, that's providing hope. So when you look at these things, even the propaganda things, like the picture of the park and the kids in it, the painting before the picture we just saw, it's like there is a kind of, to me, there is a kind of re putting dignity into this situation, even though it's also a blatant lie at the same time. This is from Leo Haas. That's him and his wife, and it's a New Year's card for 1943. It's at the Leo Baeck Institute. Despite the wishes on the card, which he's holding, one thing we see here is how the people live in Terezin, right? There's him and his wife. They're crowded on these bunks. Their belongings are all over, hanging around them, in their beds and bunks with them. And then we see on the upper left, we see a light shining. It's a light bulb, but it looks a little like, to me, like an eye too. Like it's watching this, it's witnessing this, what is happening. I don't think one would have gotten in trouble for making this if it was found, but I'm not sure, because it does show kind of these rudimentary living conditions, though they appear happy and healthy within it. But there was other artwork being created by these artists in Terezin, and almost right from the start. Many of them had been political cartoonists. They had been anti-fascist. And even if they hadn't, they now found themselves in these surroundings where they were purposely creating art that did not show the truth of Terezin. And almost from the beginning, actually, many of the artists started using their skills to document as testimony what was happening in Terezin. This is by Fritta, and I'm going to concentrate a lot on his work. Here we see a performance taking place, kind of like an acrobatic feats type carnival performance. There were many performances in the ghetto of Terezin. It was known as an art and cultural place. So this is, again, because the SS said it was, perhaps more so than anything else, because it wasn't really created with that purpose. But as you can imagine, if you deport, let's say, all the Jews in New York and you put them in a ghetto, there are going to be a lot of artists and writers and performers. Not most, but there will be many. So it's the same thing in Terezin. So there were performances and so on. I think this is quite interesting as a painting, because there's this kind of chiaroscuro style with the shadowing of darkness of light to create kind of a creepy image. We have the people watching the performance through the barrack windows above, where they've been crowded into, and here on the ground floor, gathered around and watching it as well. And we have this strange kind of clown figure, which I feel is a little bit sinister. So I would say Frida is capturing this performance that actually happened in Terezin, but he's also imbuing this image with certain colors, certain shades of light, and certain motifs that point to a darker reality. These are things Frida did in 1944, deportations to Poland. On the left, we see an elderly woman sitting on her baggage. She is about to be deported into the unknown. And on the right, and that, again, in that very shaded chiaroscuro nightmarish way, we see Jews who have been ordered to report for deportation and what was called the sluice or Schlussa. And what that was the Schlussa moved around throughout Terezin's existence, but a certain part of the barracks would be taken over as a place for arriving Jews to be registered and for Jews being deported out to be gathered and officially registered as being deported. So these are Jews who have been ordered to for deportation. And after 1942, all the trains went to Auschwitz. And yeah, and so, you know, they were crowded into these garrisons and they were registered. Sometimes they were there just a day or two, but sometimes people were there like a week. They distributed rations there, and people tried, who were there, tried, you know, to get out to be registered back into the ghetto population if they had connections. The man under the light bulb is obviously a registrar for this deportation. So, you know, so this was a very nightmarish situation, which of course is captured in a kind of cartoonish way, I'd say, in these images. This is an image Frida did of the actual deportation. The people are walking to the train through the ghetto. So, and again, it's very clear, the darkness, the gloom, the dead trees, all pointing to what is happening. So these works would not have been allowed by the SS, and works like this, which not just Britta, but all the artists were doing, had to be, or Frida, sorry, they had to be hidden. And so the artists were hiding these things. They were mostly doing them at night. They were hiding these things under their beds, in the walls of their barracks. They were burying them in the ground, doing things like this with the hope that news would get to the outside world. But they were also sometimes selling or distributing these pictures. So, for example, the two Czech brothers who were policemen, Czech non-Jewish policemen who were guards in the ghetto, they bought a lot of works that would have been considered anti-Nazi as well, and they passed them through a grapevine, and some of those eventually, it is believed, reached Switzerland and were published in a paper there. But we'll talk about that in a second. This is by Leo Haas, and it shows also people being deported out of the ghetto. And one can see again the suffering and the misery of the people as they're sent into the unknown. This is by Bedřich Frida again, and it shows people in they're living in this former kind of storefront. These people, many of them look maybe more elderly. They're crowded in there in unhygienic conditions with little food. I guess I should, well, I'll go to the next slide to mention it. But remember, the ghetto was very overcrowded. These are elderly people. This is by Norbert Troller. This is elderly people digging for potato peels. So in the ghetto, there wasn't enough food for everyone to receive the nutrition to survive. So what that was decided was they would focus on the young and the healthy and the workers, because that was the Jewish future. And also workers to the ghetto, maybe they would save it because there was slave labor in it. That was a hope, right? So they would deport everyone. However, the problem with this then is that the elderly received very meager food rations. So, and they died largely of very basic illnesses because they didn't have the nutrition needed to fight basic illnesses off. So, for example, the water in Terezin had microbes in it, and these microbes would cause diarrhea, dysentery, enteritis, you would call it. Well, in our lives, right? If something like that happened, you might be sick for a few hours or a day, have to like just hang out at home, but you'd be okay. But for the elderly people in Terezin, that it was a death sentence. They couldn't fight it off, and they quickly died of the dehydration that enteritis produced in their systems, and also they died of even things like common colds because they were just so weak and they received so little food. So they often would, you'd often see elderly people in Terezin behind the kitchens where food was distributed, digging like this for potato peels or just anything to eat, anything to eat. So this was captured by Norbert Trawler. So here's another piece of art by Pavel Fontel. The song is over. And as you can see, this is clearly an anti-Nazi caricature. He's, as I said, many of these people who were artists had a history, though not Pavel Fontel, but had a history of doing kind of political cartoons. Here we see the song is over. It's Hitler, but now things seem defeated. The wine is spilled. The guitar is dropped. He looks, indeed defeated. So it's a hope for the end of the war to come soon. So, what happened to these artists and their work? In March 1944, two things happened. There was an inspection of a barrack, and it was discovered that this man Stas had a lot of artwork, including artwork that showed the reality of the ghetto. And not only did he have some of this artwork, but he had been adding captions to it. So the captions clearly showed the reality. If you didn't know from the picture, the captions showed clearly that this was anti the SS version of Theresienstadt. In addition, it was discovered that some of these pieces of art may have been published in a Swiss newspaper. So the artists were all ordered to report for questioning by the SS. Now, at this time, in March 1944, the artists were terrified of what was going to happen. But the prisoners were warned simply to stop making pictures. The head of the Jewish administration, these kind of pictures, unapproved pictures, Dr. Epstein, who was the head of the Jewish administration, warned them, the artists as well, that the issue is serious, so they better stay alert about this. But the case was then dropped. And I think it was dropped because the Nazis had bigger things they were trying to figure out. In only a few months, the Red Cross was coming, and they needed these artists, and they needed a full technical department to create this fantasy of the ghetto and what it was for the Red Cross. So at this time, the case was dropped. They were just told, do not make pictures like this anymore, or you will be in big trouble. So everything was quiet. The Red Cross visited. They were apparently fooled, at least in their official reports. They said the Jews in Terezin are being treated well. There's no problems. The Nazis decided they would go ahead and make this movie because, now that they already were successful in this one propagandic pursuit. However, once the settings and so on for the movie were prepared, of course, they mostly were done because the stuff built for the Red Cross and the paint jobs and all that were still in place. On July 17th, 1944, the artists were rounded up and arrested. They thought they had gotten away scot-free, but they had not. And they were brought to the prison in Terezin, which is called the Little Fortress, the Kleine Festung. And there were many prisoners in the Little Fortress, and most of them were actually not Jewish. The Gestapo used the Little Fortress for political prisoners for the most part. But sometimes Jewish prisoners from the ghetto, which was, the Little Fortress was right at the edge of the ghetto, were also brought there. And so they brought these artists. They were locked in cells. There were about 80 to 100 prisoners in each cell. It was a brutal, brutal place. People were beaten up, tortured. They had to do forced exercises till they collapsed. And and they had to do kind of meaningless forced labor. It was a very brutal place, and where many people were murdered. This is the doors to the cells as it looks today. If you were to go to Terezin and visit the Little Fortress, which probably some of you have. Ferdinand Felix Bloch. He was an artist as well, and he came from this cartoonist background. We haven't really talked about him too much, or really not at all. I focused more on Frida. But he was one of those. He was tortured in the Little Fortress, sorry, and eventually he was beaten to death. And his wife, who was imprisoned with him, was also murdered. These artists, their wives and children were also imprisoned with them. So now we're going to go to what happened to them. So in October of 1944, there were the last large mass deportations from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. And these artists became part of those. So all the artists that had been in the Little Fortress were now sent to Auschwitz. This is a painting, or a drawing, sorry, made by Leo Haas, but after the war, of prisoners in Auschwitz. When they arrived in Auschwitz, they were considered political prisoners, this group of artists. So they were not killed right away, but they were sent in, they were registered and sent into the camp. They were already very weak from their time in the Little Fortress in Terezin, where they had been brutalized and starved. And they began to die of exhaustion and hunger within Auschwitz itself. Leo Haas, however, survived. And like I said, he made this after the war. This is Leo Haas. Later in life, he lived until the 1980s. After the war, he moved to East Berlin, and he actually picked up his career as an illustrator for political magazines. Norbert Traller, who is represented at the Leo Baeck Institute, also survived. He was lucky enough to be liberated in Auschwitz when the Soviets arrived in January 1945. So this is a drawing made in the ghetto of a little boy named Thomas, and this was Frida's son. He was killed, and his wife was, I don't know if I can't remember now. I think his wife was killed too. But the boy survived. And Leo Haas, after the war, him and his wife, who had both survived Auschwitz, they adopted him and they raised him. So that's a kind of a nice story. I'm going to end with this picture, which was done by Frida, of the ghetto, because I think it really describes very well as a picture the whole story of the ghetto. Here we have these fake storefronts, which were actually created in the ghetto for the Red Cross visit and the resultant movie, selling perfumes and groceries. But as we see, it's just the front of the building. The back is on stilts, and it's clearly just all a fake. And then on the left here, we see, and the windows above, we see kind of images of what could be people crowded into them. So I'm gonna end my talk here, and I would be happy to answer any questions or hear people's comments. So hold on, and I will stop sharing for right now. And
Thank you, Michael. That was great. So much art represented here. Thank you so much. Yeah, and if anybody has a question, feel free to put it in the chat box. I had one that I wanted to ask about for the artists. We know that they wanted to share what was happening, the reality of it. And we often think too of art as being cathartic for, the artists themselves. Did you find any testimonies that attested to that, that they continued, that it nourished them or fed them in some way?
I didn't, but I think one reason is that so few of the artists survived, and so we don't really have their testimony. Now I have Norbert Trawler. We have at work. He wrote a book. Oh, I can't really see it, but it's about Theresienstadt. And this is his autobiography, in fact. But he doesn't really talk about it either. He says this is what happened, and we were making these works in secret at night. But he doesn't really say about the reasons why. But I think it's pretty clear. I mean, that to create this work would have been very dangerous, and I think as it did end up being very dangerous for them, as we heard. And so I think it wasn't explained because it so clearly was indeed an attempt. And that's why I also talked about some of the other things that were approved, because even in those, I think you can see a little bit of defiance or resistance. We also have one by Joe Spire, which I didn't show. And it is a time when they were fumigating some barracks in Terezin. And he has a sign up front of the barracks, which probably was really there, and the streets blocked off, and it says danger, poison gas. But you have to wonder if that was a double entendre, because people had heard rumors, and where that barracks was located is kind of the same road that was used when people were being deported out of the ghetto into the unknown. But it is true, they don't talk so much about what the art meant to them. And I think they were hopeful that I think that some would reach the outside world, but it was also very dangerous because, of course, when the SS discovered that, that's what really led to this arrest of all the artists and
Right.
the terrible brutality that most did not survive from.
Thank you. Yeah, and Colleen just put the link in for the lessons.
Oh, good. Thank you.
They're amazing. Yeah. And Jaylene is asking, have you ever researched the musical side of art in Theresienstadt?
We do have, yes, we have material related to Victor Ullmann and to Brundabar. And yes, that we have a lot of musical people represented at the Leo Baeck in the archives. And of course, it's a big topic. There were so many people who did create music in Theresienstadt. And I think the thing to think about with music, though, is that, to get tickets and so on to see those kind of things was not easy. Most people in Terezin were exhausted. They were in labor commandos, doing kinds of slave labor around the camp. Most people did not get the chance to experience the kind of cultural life that Terezin could offer, because there was simply high demand and just not a lot of room. And
Sure.
people kind of had to pay their way in, usually by trading cigarettes or supplies or something, doing some service for someone.
Right.
So
Thank you. Jerome is asking, are there significant permanent collections and exhibitions of art from Terezin?
I don't, there's always new shows about Terezin that are coming and going. I would say, if you were interested in seeing art from Terezin, there's a lot at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, There's a lot at the Jewish Museum in Prague as well, and then in Israel, at a few museums in Israel. That's where most of it is. There's not as much here in the United States, to be sure. Yeah, we have, like, we're lucky to have the Norbert Trawler stuff, and we have some of the other artists represented too, as we saw in this. But we, but yeah, we don't have the majority by any means. Frida's stuff, I think, is all in at the Jewish Museum Berlin for the most part.
Right. Yeah, and definitely go to Terezin itself and
Yes,
see they have a lot of it exhibited as well.
yeah, they do. That is true.
Wonderful. Well, Michael, again, we want to thank you for your time today and for your knowledge and expertise on this subject. This has been really excellent. Colleen is going to put um, a link for a follow-up survey for all of you to fill out if you want to grab that now. We appreciate your feedback on that. And I noticed that Colleen also put the Magdeburg Barracks in Terezin, a link to that because they have a lot of that artwork as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, we will follow up with an email with the recording for this if you want to go back and watch anything. It will also go on our YouTube channel, and then we'll send you all of the oh, I will change that. It says it's marked private. Whoops. And I will make sure that you get all of the resources that Michael mentioned today in that follow-up email as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. Thank you for having me, everyone. Thanks.
Our pleasure.
Hope it's a
Bye-bye,
lot.
everybody. Have a good weekend.